Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of Cultural Markisms. My name's Mark Powell, and this afternoon we have a very special guest with us. It's Bindi Cole Chocka. You've probably heard about her. If you haven't, then you're in for a real treat. It's a fascinating story of forgiveness, of identity politics, and most of all of redemption. Bindi is a famous Australian artist, but more than really her art, or just as importantly as her art, is her faith and how that has freed her to live, I guess, really the most flourishing life. So good afternoon and welcome, Bindi, to the show.
Hi, it's great to see you and good to be here.
Yeah, it's great. Now, Bindi, there'd be a lot of people out there that already know your story, but it's a fascinating story. Can you give us a quick recap of your life, how you grew up, and how you came to faith in Jesus?
Sure. I lived through quite a traumatic childhood. I was an only child to a single mother who was very creative and loving in one sense, but in another sense, she was also a heroin addict, a prostitute, and a stripper. And my father, who has Aboriginal heritage, was absent throughout my childhood. Yeah. And when I was about 8, I was removed from her because of her drug use. And I spent about 4 years living with my Aboriginal grandmother, which was actually a really nice time for me. Better. And then at 13, I moved back in with my mum because she had completed the methadone program. She was actually the first person in Victoria to successfully complete the methadone program. Apparently you don't complete it now. I don't know the ins and outs. It's quite different. But at that time you did, and she would pick up her methadone from Solly Lou's chemist on Fitzroy Street. Anyways, I moved back in with her at 13, and she introduced me to drugs at that time. So we would smoke marijuana together and drink regularly, and I would score drugs for her. And then 3 years later, she died of cancer. And I had to watch her die slowly. And I think it set off this chain of events in my life where I'd watched her work really hard to turn her life around. Although it wasn't perfect, she had tried hard to get off drugs and to make a life for herself. And actually in that 3 years, she had begun to write and had quickly found success as a playwright. And I watched her sit there and write entire plays. I watched that process from kind of germination of the seed of the idea right through to the production of the play. I acted in some of her plays. She had some of her work published, and she was really building a name for herself as a successful writer. And then I watched her die quite quickly. I think it was 3 months from diagnosis to death. And as I was saying, it kind of gave me this, I guess I just lost any desire for a good life, or I lost any hope that there was good in the world, actually, because I had watched her struggle and succeed and then die. And I just thought, well, what's the point? Yeah. And I didn't care about myself. I didn't care about others. I just saw no point in anything. And I was already heavily using drugs at 16, and it sent me on a downhill trajectory into another 8 years of drug addiction that included a 4-year relationship with a man who beat and abused me. I did work and do different things over that time. I always had a decent work ethic, which is strange. But I found myself at about 20 needing to get out of this relationship that I'd been in that was quite abusive. And so I left him, and not long after I bought a ticket to London and got a working holiday visa, which a lot of people did back then, which no one can do now, but you did back then. And I hopped on a plane and went to London. And within a year of being in London, despite my efforts to run away from myself and my pain and my drug use, I was much more addicted and in much more trouble. The first day I arrived, I used drugs. I think I was 22 or 23. And I arrived on my own with $20 in my pockets. I found drugs that day. Within 12 months, I was down to 42 kilos. I was selling drugs in nightclubs to survive and support my habit. I was I overdosed 3 times, including having to be defibrillated, and I would regularly go into a drug-induced psychosis because I wouldn't sleep. So I would stay awake for 2, 3, 4 nights on end.
Wow.
And then I'd finally sleep. I might get locked up in a hospital or in a cell, and I'd sleep and I'd wake up and I'd kind of just continue on the cycle. And I remember at one point thinking to myself, if I don't stop this, I'm going to die.
Yeah.
And it was almost that I felt death on me. And I realized at that point that I didn't want to die, but I couldn't stop what I was doing. I felt like there was no hope. I'd wake up in the morning and think, today I won't do this, I'll stop. But by midday I would have used. I was back into that cycle. And then I tried to get some help for myself. I visited a couple of rehabs and I couldn't find any help. And in the midst of all of that, I remember for the very first time hearing God's voice. And I didn't realize it at the time, but it's kind of biblical, actually. The voice that I heard was loud and it was repetitive and it was within me. And it said over and over and over, call out to my son, call out to my son, call out to my son. And so I did. I got on my knees and I called out to Jesus and I was like, Jesus, help me. And what happened next isn't what most people would expect to happen. But it's what I needed. Within a week of calling out to Jesus, I was arrested and locked up.
Wow. So Jesus literally got you off the streets.
Yes, that's correct. He arrested me. And so I was ultimately sentenced to 4 years in a British jail. And served 2 years. So I think I was 24 to 26, those 2 years in jail. And in that time, within a month of arriving in jail, I had given my life to Jesus. I had met some volunteers. They would come in all the time and speak to me and just take the time to listen to me and love me. And I started to read the Bible and attend church in prison and pray regularly. And it was the very beginning, because it's been a long, slow conversion for me. I was kind of the most reluctant convert in some ways and have almost become the most thoroughly converted person. But it was a
Paul of Damascus experience.
Yeah,
maybe
well, that's
we should call you a Pauline of Damascus.
Yeah. It was a bit like that. I think, look, I think initially my encounters with God were all supernatural. And as somebody who thinks deeply about things, I needed to then take probably the next 10 years to process that supernatural thought through my rational brain. Yeah. And I couldn't divorce. It was like I needed to have both faith and reason combined together. I couldn't divorce the two. The experience was one thing, but on its own, it almost wasn't enough. It was like I knew that God was real. I knew that Jesus was real, but I needed to reconcile everything that I thought about the world and myself with the Bible and with these supernatural experiences. And so it took a very long time for me.
Now, if we fast forward a few years, you've become a Christian, you come back to Australia. A lot of people would know you from the Andrew Bolt controversy. Can you just sum up what happened there? What was all that about?
Sure. When I got out of prison and I came back to Australia, within a year I was studying photography. I knew that I had realized in prison that I wanted to be a photographer or an artist of sorts. I knew that I was creative. And so I was studying and I began to make artwork. And very quickly, similarly to my mum, I achieved some success as an artist. One of the reasons I achieved some success was because one of my early exhibitions was a series of portraits of myself and my family in blackface. And they were called, you've seen it?
Yeah, I was thinking, would you get away with that today? It's almost viscerally shocking to see that.
Yeah, well, what's really interesting too, just as an aside, is that the art world, it's so progressive and really filtering art these days through these kind of progressive values. But that work is my most collected and is in probably every significant collection in this country. Wow. So it just goes to show.
Oh,
But I made that work of me and my family in blackface. At the time, clearly I'd been in prison for a couple of years. Prior to that, I'd had, 10 years of drug addiction. I honestly had no idea who I was outside of prison and without drugs.
yeah.
And so I began to use art as a methodology to unpack and explore my identity.
Yeah.
And although I'd had this experience in prison with Jesus and church, when I got out, I kind of put it all to one side for a while and tried to explore my identity in other ways. I thought maybe ways that were easier, ways that weren't going to cost me in the way that coming out as a Christian might cost me. And so I made this work as an indication of pride in my heritage. I actually was placing my identity within the realms of identity politics. So I think we look so often, especially for me, I didn't really have a family and a unit to look to find my identity. And so I probably looked to the media as a reflection of who I was. And in doing so, I placed myself in identity politics. I looked for my identity in my race, my gender, my victimhood was a big one, and all of these things. And I made this work indicating pride in my heritage, but being fair-skinned. And he saw it. And the day before the show opened, he saw it and he began to blog about it. And at the time, he was really talking a lot about how there was this gravy train to be had if you identified as Aboriginal. And he accused me of only identifying as Aboriginal to get political and career clout, I suppose, and because I was opportunistic. And so, in all fairness, I don't think that I was. I think I was genuinely trying to explore my identity. However, I do think that there is now, in hindsight, I do think that there is a gravy train to be had for identifying as Aboriginal, 100%. And so he began to blog about me, and he actually brought me and my work to national attention. In some ways, he birthed my artistic practice.
Isn't that the irony?
And when we get to it, it ended at him as well. He's like the bookends of a decade of my life. But I ended up being contacted by an Aboriginal legal firm who asked me if I was interested in taking him to court to defend my character. And I said, yes, I was. This was 10 years ago. And I got together with 7 other people who he had also written about in the same way, and we took him to court. At the time, what I didn't understand was that the law we were using was actually a direct attack on free speech. I did not understand that. I didn't understand that the Racial Discrimination Act was a tool that was being used to tear down our freedoms when it came to speech, because it's a law that's based on offence and humiliation. And the difficulty with that is who defines offence and humiliation and those things. So it's a law based on feelings rather than anything concrete. All I wanted to do was defend my character. And so we took him to court. It took 2 years. I ended up testifying in federal court. Only 2 of us did. I was one. And we won that case. He was found guilty of breaching the Racial Discrimination Act and in many ways publicly labelled a racist. What was interesting about that was at that time, especially when the court case was being finalised, I made the choice to go back to church and to reignite the faith that I'd found when I was in prison. And as I do this and I slowly begin to read the Bible again and pray over the next couple of years, I begin to feel God tearing down this victim identity that I had built and confronting me to confront all the ways in which I had constructed myself as the victim. And so, which was really uncomfortable.
So just to clarify something there, if I can, Bindi, you met Jesus in prison 10 years before the Bolt incident. But I guess in between that time, you weren't really going to church, you weren't growing as a Christian. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it wasn't quite 10 years. It was probably about 6 years, 5 or 6 years.
Yep.
that I'd been out of prison when I began to make this work and came to his attention.
Yep.
It wasn't long in the scheme of things.
Yep.
And I hadn't been, that's right, I had put my Christianity to one side.
Okay.
And although I believed that God was real and existed, I wasn't living it out or walking it out in any genuine way. And
Yeah.
so one of the things I think happened was that while I was in prison, what I needed to understand was that I was loved, and God showed me that for the first time in my life. I genuinely felt loved in a tiny cell on the other side of the room.
Yeah.
I knew that I was deeply and profoundly loved, but that's
Yeah.
kind of one step in your walk with God. The next
Yeah.
step is repentance, and I hadn't ever come to that point at this stage.
Okay. Okay.
And so I took him to court, and then I start going back to church, and I start reigniting this faith, and I begin to really go through a serious conversion process where he's tearing down my identity and he's rebuilding it.
Yeah.
And as I do this, I surprisingly, I was not expecting, kind of start to move over to a conservative side politically,
Wow.
where I think I had really been probably, I mean, if I was still where I was today, I'd probably be in Antifa. I was really progressive, very social justice warrior-like.
Yeah.
And I was a queen of that. The work that I made really represented that, and I was lauded for that in the art world. I got a lot of success.
Yeah.
And
Now,
so
you took him to court, you won. At what point do you think, oh my goodness, I've done the wrong thing, I need to apologize? At what point in those proceedings?
So I took him to court, won the court case. It was probably a couple of years after.
Okay.
As I'm praying and I'm seeking God. So it wasn't in the middle of that, but it's starting to kind of germinate within me.
Okay.
And I'm thinking, I think I made a mistake. Not that I made a mistake in defending my character, but I made a mistake in using that particular law.
Okay.
So in hindsight, I think if I was going to do it, it would have been better to use defamation laws rather than the Racial Discrimination Act. Anyway, I start to feel remorse at what I'd done. I start to realize that he's not a racist.
Yeah.
That I've helped to set a precedent to establish this limitation on free speech.
Yeah.
And I start to talk to my husband about the idea of apologizing to him and reconciling with him. And my husband was shocked at first.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And but he eventually came around. But one of the great things about my husband is that he's very wise, and he said, I think if this is something that you really need to do, and it's something that you're feeling compelled to do by the Holy Spirit, then let God bring it about. And so I began to make some videos around my conversion and my ideas. And one of those videos eventually got picked up and seen by Andrew Bolt. And he made a phone call to me.
Oh, he reached out to you.
He reached out to me.
Okay.
Because of the content of one of my videos where I talk about my political conversion and my thoughts around the court case that I was a part of. And as he did, I apologized to him privately. I apologized to him privately on the phone.
And can I ask, if it's not too personal and breaking confidences, what did he say when you apologized to him?
He was very gracious and he thanked me. And he just, I think he was in shock, probably.
Yeah.
But he was very gracious and he thanked me. And then in the next day in the paper, he wrote an apology to me as well.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. What did he say?
Yeah. He said, I'm sorry. He said, Bindi Cole Chocka has apologized to me. She still feels that she was right in defending her character. And for that, what I have done, I'm sorry.
Wow.
Yeah. So we both apologized to each other. And then he invited me onto his show where I spoke about how I regretted using this law, that I didn't think he was a racist, and that the reason I had come to this conclusion was because I had converted to Christianity and realized that there's no victim identity in Christianity, none whatsoever. We are all called to take responsibility for everything that we've ever done and to account for it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so it was a pretty amazing moment, really. He was nervous, I was nervous, and
Can I just ask, what did he say about your conversion to Christianity and how Christ had empowered you to forgive? Did he say anything about that?
He said that he feels like he is going to get there one day. He just hasn't had the moment.
Wow.
And so I think that was one of my reasons as well. I thought this is a fantastic testimony to him because I know that he was, in hindsight, I understand how damaging the court case was for him. And I don't mean reputation-wise. It hasn't affected his reputation. It hasn't affected his success. I mean personally and internally, I believe that it was painful and damaging to be labelled a racist. And I love that it's because of God that he got the apology, not because of anything else.
Yeah, that's great. Hey, everyone. Don't forget to tune in tomorrow night for the weekly wrap-up with Karina Ocatel. Some of the best stories of the week. It'll be unmissable viewing, a great recap of the week in case you've missed anything. That's tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. I'll see you then. I saw an artwork of yours. Now, a lot of your artwork is not just the normal medium of just, paint or drawing, but it draws in a lot of multimedia. There's one particular artwork, and it literally took my breath away when I first saw it. It's called 77 Times, where you have video of a number of Aboriginal people just saying, "I forgive you." And it was so striking that it made me gasp. It was really powerful. Well done. It's a great piece of art.
Thank you. It was one of my earlier works, right. At the beginning of that conversion process, not when I got out of prison, but when I returned back to church. And I think it was I started to explore forgiveness a lot in my work because for the first time, as I said, in prison, I understood that I was loved. Now God had flipped it on me, and for the first time I understood that I wasn't the victim but the perpetrator. I had been a victim in my life, and we were all both, I think, but he needed me to see how I had been the perpetrator and to take responsibility, that I was the wretch. And then, having shown me that, he forgave me for all of it instantaneously. And it was something that was mind-blowing to me, especially because I'd been in prison and I truly understood the nature of right and wrong in some ways, and punishment and loss of freedom. And so I began to think, and what happened as I was forgiven, of course, I began to forgive other people in my world who had hurt me from my childhood to my present. And in that process, I discovered that I began to experience a freedom, a sense of peace, and things that I had been searching for in my life for so long. Like there was many years I could never be alone with my own head. I had to have noise all the time or take drugs. Now I could be alone with my head. My thoughts were okay. It was like I experienced this internal freedom that allowed me to be much more effective in my life too. And so I thought, wow, I wonder if what I'm experiencing on a personal, individual level is actually what's missing from a communal or corporate level within the Aboriginal community, because I had grown up and spent time in the Aboriginal community. And so I kind of wanted to bring those ideas forward in a different type of leadership to the community, because I see that we've had the apology, we've had money poured into the community, we've had programs, endless welfare, and nothing seems to be happening. In fact, community problems seem to be compounding. And I realized that we cover over problems that happen in the Aboriginal community by justifying them because of colonization and racism. And so we victimize everybody there. And what happens is it means that they're entirely disempowered, because even though things happen to you in your life and you're a victim, and I understand I was sexually and physically abused, I was beaten and neglected, all of these things. Despite that, I had to take responsibility for myself and my healing and my journey.
Yeah.
When I realized that, I thought, that's what's missing. And we had the apology, I'm sorry, but we haven't had the response, I forgive you.
Yeah.
And I think once we have that, I forgive you, once the community is ready to say, I forgive you, and to take responsibility for itself, we'll never move forward. And so I made this artwork.
Just on that, Bindi, I mean, it's such a powerful message and so needed to be heard, and I applaud you for it. How has the Aboriginal community in general responded to your conversion, both to Christ and I guess really from being progressive to conservative, but more than politics? How have they responded to your message of reconciliation through forgiveness?
I mean, it's been an absolutely mixed response.
Yeah.
In some ways, I've been excommunicated from the Koori arts community.
Right.
I think they feel like I've betrayed them on some
Yeah.
level. But I still have many Koori friends and my family, of course. I mean, I just can't get away from it if I try. It is what it is, you know, I live it out. But it's been a mixed response. When I talk to people one-on-one and I talk them through my story and my journey and say, this is why I'm advocating for forgiveness, this is what's worked for me, then people are on board.
Yeah.
But when I talk corporately and people don't really understand the depth of what I'm trying to share or the complexity and how it will lead to freedom, I think it can get lost sometimes.
Yeah, I noticed even today there's been a new government initiative about closing the gap, reducing Indigenous incarceration, helping with education, all sorts of social policies. But it seems to me they're looking at the symptoms when the deeper heart problem is this, really, isn't it? It's reconciliation. Yes. It's reconciliation with God through Christ.
Yeah, it's missing the mark entirely. It's the breakdown of the family. It's cultural issues. It's absent fathers. It's all of these things that are happening on the ground in communities that are causing the problems.
Yeah.
And so I don't understand why we just keep going in with the same solution over and over and over again. All we're doing is disincentivizing getting well. Actually, we're disempowering again. We're saying you are victims. We're going to come in. It's kind of paternalistic. Actually.
Yeah, it is.
We're going to keep coming in over and over because we're the ones who can fix you. But actually, it's a lie. Nobody coming in can fix. You can support, but it has to start within the community and within each individual within the community by taking responsibility.
The irony there is, do you think it's accurate to say it's almost like a new progressive colonialism, the solution that's being currently offered? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would agree with you 100%. It's just a constant repetition of the past, really, and it's that what do they say, that soft bigotry of low expectations.
Yeah.
I think the greatest racist act that you can do is not treat someone equal to you in terms of their potential and ability, saying, well, I can achieve this. You can't. You might be able to with my help. I think that's true racism. We should treat people as equals. When do we stop treating the Aboriginal community as special? That they need special help. Actually, they're just as capable as anybody else.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? I don't mean that in the wrong. I don't want that to come across.
No, absolutely.
Way.
Yeah.
I just Yeah.
I mean, look, I think there's some, I interviewed a few weeks ago, Dr. Anthony Dillon at the Australian Catholic University, or, Jacinta Namajinga Price, who I just have enormous respect for, who's very much, I think, along the same lines that you are, talking about taking individual responsibility. Unfortunately, that sort of common sense is not that common anymore. But yeah, now if I want to just go forward now for where you are now, so you apologised to Andrew Bolt. You were one of Australia's leading Indigenous artists, and so I guess it's all gone swimmingly from there for you. Yes?
Absolutely not.
No.
In such a strange way. It's like my forgiving Andrew Bolt has become the unforgivable sin. To the broader world, and particularly the art world, because the day that I went on his show and spoke about my apology to him, about my conservative Christian views, I was pulled out of an exhibition the next day, and it was probably the final one for my year. Up until that point, I was generally in, on average, 8 to 10 exhibitions a year in Australia-wide. Since that day, I haven't been in a single exhibition, and that's almost 2 years later. So I've been cancelled by the art world.
Wow. But I mean, in that time, you haven't stopped producing art, and in particular, you're now studying for your doctorate.
Correct.
Can you tell us a little bit about what's your doctorate on? I know it's related to art theory, but give us an idea of what you're studying.
I'm doing a PhD that is practice-based. So I not only write a thesis, but I make a body of work.
Right.
And it's looking at how the Christian conversion remakes and reframes the artist and the artistic practice. And so I'm basically doing it on this whole experience in some ways. If you look at my artistic practice from beginning to end, you'll see my conversion across it. If you look at one of my works, it's like we're looking at 1 minute of a movie. You need to almost look at my entire practice as a whole to see the whole story, because I've used it as a tool to unpack and explore my identity and reconcile my identity with myself.
Yeah.
And so in the midst of my PhD, that's the kind of main theme. But then, because of what's happened, I'm researching the place of Christian art in the art world, the place of conservative art in the secular art world, and the way art is used to disseminate ideas as well. So, for example, universities, we all understand, have been kind of taken over by leftists and Marxists, and so has
a little bit,
and so has the entertainment industry and the art world, in exactly the same way. And so, one of the things that I've come across in my research is how art is so important in the dissemination of ideas, in the spreading of ideas. Ideas generally start at the academic, philosophical, or religious, theological level within academia. And the very first level of those ideas entering society is through art, and high art, the type of art that I was making. Because those artists and those artworks are the groundbreakers. They break the ground for the new ideas, and then that starts to get out that way, and then slowly it enters into the media and entertainment, and then into the household. And the very last place that those ideas enter, surprisingly, is actually into the church.
Yeah.
And so we've ceded that territory of dissemination of ideas to the left, because they've taken over these particular worlds. And so this is all of this is some of the research that I'm doing in alignment with what's happened with my practice in being cancelled.
So share with me, you'll graduate from, hopefully, God willing, your PhD. What's in the future for Bindi Cole Chocka? What are some of the plans that God has put on your heart that you think are the things that he's leading you to do? Can you share with the audience that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to share with it, because I've been working for the last couple of months with a group of amazing people. And what we're planning on doing is creating a global community of Christian artists. So rather than just sit back and accept defeat, because actually there's no place in the art world for Christian or conservative work unless it's ironic or critical.
Right.
I don't know if you visit galleries often, but those out there who do, you will see it would be hard for you to recall the last time you've seen a Christian work, but particularly a Christian conservative work.
Yeah, true.
You just won't see it in galleries. You might see some Christian work, but it's more subjective or slightly universal or ambiguous. It's not really very sincere or offering a kind of a moment of transcendence.
So how can Christians, particularly conservative Christians, take back that space, Bindi? What are some ideas, suggestions?
Well, one of the things that we're looking at doing is establishing a gallery in each state. In the main city, in each state, we're looking to purchase buildings and build galleries that are for Christian artists. That's number one. We're then really interested in collecting art globally by Christian artists and creating huge, important collections that we can then create shows out of. One of the ideas that I'm very excited about is taking back the art world for the church. So it seems to me that we've really ceded that territory, even as a church. We've let that go. We've kind of become postmodern churches when it comes to beauty and architecture and art. A lot of them are not beautiful. They're almost these kind of ugly spaces in some ways. But what they are empty buildings that could easily become galleries. So one of the ideas that we have is to create this beautiful collection of artworks, this community of Christian artists, that we can produce shows that can go to each of these churches. And what we do is start a global movement of turning all of these churches into galleries.
Now, I'm thinking there'll be people watching the show this afternoon. They're either Christians or they might even be Christian leaders, and they're thinking, what a great idea. I've got a church building that's vacant pretty well 6 days of the week. It's used on Sundays. I could easily host a gallery or an art show for Christian artists. If somebody's interested in doing that, can they just get in touch with you and give you a call and say, look, I would love to do that? What's the way forward?
Absolutely. Just get in touch with me. You can get to my website and you can email me directly from there. We already have a history of putting exhibitions into churches. We've done it a number of times now. We offer not only exhibitions of artworks, but artist talks and programs that run alongside it. We're hoping to develop that to even performance pieces and film work, so you could almost have a little mini arts festival. And not only is this arts festival for you and your congregants, but it's a form of outreach to your local community. So you can bring people in to see these shows. You can bring them in to view the art. We can have artist talks, but also you can offer your local artists a chance to exhibit their work alongside these global, amazing Christian peers of theirs, these artists.
So, for instance, Bindi, if there was a church that wanted to host an evangelistic night to invite their friends to see Christian work, maybe have you come and speak, share your testimony, you'd be open to things like that?
100%. I'm open to things like that. And one of the really great things about all of this too is that we want it to be symbiotic. So we want to take back the art world for churches and turn churches into galleries. But at the same time, we then want to identify amazing Christian artists, get their work back into the art world as well. So we're influencing the art world and we're taking back that actual secular space for God too.
Now, just on that, Bindi, there'd be a lot of people at least some, I'm hoping, watching this that are thinking, I'm young, I'm artistically talented, I'm not sure there's a future in it, I just don't know the way forward. What sort of advice would you give to the young artists? They may be young in age or maybe just young in terms of experience or getting their work out there. What advice would you give them?
To keep at it. You know, with me, early on in my artistic practice, I worked as a freelance photographer for many years and I supported myself while I made art. Now I don't have to necessarily do that, but that took quite a long time. And so I think it's one of those things where you actually can make a living from it. If your art is good and people are interested in it, definitely have a go. The other thing I would say is really look at what's happening in the art world. Look at the art that's successful, that's not. One of the reasons that my practice has been interesting, I think, is because I established it when I wasn't really walking with Jesus. I established a very postmodern practice. So I use a whole different set of art strategies. I do video and installation. I don't paint. I don't draw. Not that those things are bad. Absolutely do those things. But look at what's happening in the art world. Look at the movements that are happening and be influenced by that too. So you can see what's happening. There's a lot of Christian artists who are kind of stuck on the outskirts because they're not really checking out what's going on. And the other thing I would say to young artists is study art. There's so many young Christian artists who have a raw talent, but it's actually very important that you go and you get some art history into you. And I actually mean go to art school. Get some skills, develop that talent. You need that kind of incubation period as well.
Just on that, I think that's so inspiring. I know many young artists myself, and I'm thinking I'd love to be able to recommend this to them. What about the place? I'm thinking in schools, but also universities, of developing art programs where we can, have workshops and even week-long intensives and where we're getting people together. Is there any plans for that in the future?
Absolutely. We're looking at developing retreats for Christian artists where we'd get a whole bunch of artists together. We'd get their peers from the art world to come and talk and do workshops. We'd have space, studio spaces for people to develop new works there. We'd have mentors. And of course, we'd have worship and fellowship and biblical study and all of these things and just build this community and help develop each other. And one of the greatest ways an artist develops is by being around other artists. We all influence each other. There's probably no real genuinely new ideas. We're all just kind of influenced by each other in many ways.
That's so true. I remember when Bill Leak died, I was so fascinated by him that I read everything about him. And apparently he'd get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, read the papers, and he never had an original idea. He said he would, by 6 o'clock, he'd be on the phone to all of his friends, just talking through ideas to be able to inspire the next cartoon that he would draw that day. So I can see how beneficial it is to, rub shoulders with other people. I think always the Bible says, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. Bindi, it's been so great to have you with us this afternoon. Please, check out Bindi Cole Chocka on her website. I think it's bindicolechocka.com. There's lots of great resources, lots of great examples of her artwork there. It's been wonderful to have you with us this afternoon, Bindi. I look forward to having you back again sometime. But if you're interested in hosting one of the galleries that Bindi's talked about this afternoon, please get in contact with her. I think it's a great initiative, a great ministry initiative. If you want to have an outreach night where you can have Bindi or one of her associates come and speak, display artwork, I think it's a great way of reaching out to our community. I think that's it for this afternoon. Thank you again for joining us, Bindi. And I look forward to seeing you next time on The Good Source. My name has been Mark Powell, and this has been Cultural Markisms. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Cultural Markisms is a production of The Good Source, hosted by Mark Powell. To watch, listen to, or read more content without the SJW PC fact filter, visit goodsource.news. That's good, SAUCE.news. Become a Good Source supporter for exclusive access to live and unedited interview recordings, including the conversations before and after the show.